Go ahead and get started this morning. Welcome to Community Church Unitarian Universalist virtual worship service, where we gather each week beyond our four walls to be together in these unique times. My name is Donald Ray, CCU member and worship associate. Today, the Reverend Paul Beedle will be offering the sermon Commitment. Reverend Paul has served First Unitarian Universalist Church of New Orleans since 2013. His essay, Origins of Unitarianism and Universalism in New Orleans, will shortly be published in the Journal of Unitarian Universalist History. Reverend Paul has served on the UUA's Music Leadership Certification Committee as a reflection group facilitator in the UUMA's Ministerial Formation Network, and from time to time as a congregational consultant. A trained spiritual director and an amateur musician and composer, his special interest in history and theology will come through in his sermon this morning. Community Church Unitarian Universalist is a progressive, open-minded, and inclusive religious community. All who are on spiritual search for truth and meaning are welcome. Ours is a faith in action, as we do the work of justice and elevate compassion in our quest to live ethically and recognition of the inherent worth and dignity of all. We believe it is not necessary to think alike in order to love alike. We are very glad to have you join us in this service of worth giving. Reverend Paul will be singing our introit this morning.
Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times. Come, yet again come. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. Ours is no caravan of despair, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times. Come, yet again come.
Thank you, Reverend Paul. It is Community Church's custom to light a chalice invoking hope and eternal truth to our worship. Please join me in reading the words in the chat box together. We light this flame by member Bert Brunson. We light this flame to affirm the light of truth and knowledge, the warmth of love and community, and the fire of hope and commitment. Ms. Cynthia Ramirez will now do our religious education.
Good morning. This one is called Baking Fish. Once a little girl was sitting in the kitchen watching her mother preparing fish. Excuse me, one second. I'm sorry. Okay, once a little girl was sitting in the kitchen watching her mother preparing fish for lunch. She saw that her mother took the fish and cut its head and tail before placing it into a baking pan. The little girl was curious to see this. She questioned her mother, "Mom, why did you cut the head and tail of the fish before putting it into the pan?" The little girl's mother thought for a while and then said, "I don't know the reason, but it was always been done like this. Your grandmother did it the same way." The little girl was still curious, as this answer was not satisfactory to her. She thought for a while and then went to see her grandmother. She asked her grandma, "Why did you cut the head and tail of fish before baking it?" Grandma was surprised by the question. She thought for a while and said, "I don't know the reason. My mother taught me to cook fish that way only." The little girl still wanted to know about it, so she went to her great-grandma, who was outside sitting on the couch, on the porch. The girl went to her and asked the same question. "Grandma, why did you cut the head and tail of fish before baking?" Great-grandma thought for a while and replied, "Oh, that is because my baking pan was too small to fit the whole fish." The end.
Thank you, Miss Cynthia. Now is the time in our service where we celebrate our deepest joys so that we may lift each other up in time of celebration. We also make space for our most profound sorrows so that we may not grieve alone. Please type any joys and sorrows you may have into the chat box, and they'll be read aloud after the music.
I brought my spirit to the sea. I stood upon the shore. I gazed upon infinity. I heard the waters roar. And then there came a sense of peace. Some whisper calmed my soul. Some ancient ministry of stars had made my spirit whole. I brought my spirit to the trees that loomed against the sky. I touched each wandering, careless breeze to know if God was nigh. And then I felt an inner flame that fiercely burned my tears. Upright I rose from bended knee to meet the asking years.
Thank you, Reverend Paul. I'll go ahead and read the joys and sorrows that have been placed into the chat box. Daniel Meaden says, sorrow for the tragedy in Beirut. This looks like an email address here, but keep Wayne Nettles in your thoughts. And Angel Arata says, my sister and her family recovering from COVID. Reverend Jacqueline says Liz Jenkins is listening and sends greetings, so that's great. And that appears to be the end of the stuff in the chat box, but we also recognize the joys that are just bubbling up, the ones that are just too new to share, and the sorrows that are unspoken. Please know that you are not alone in your difficult times. I'll also go ahead and post the contact info for the caring team into the chat box should you need anything from them or from one of our UU ministers. Sorry, copy and paste is not wanting to work for me, but I got it here. Okay, thank you. Community Church Unitarian Universalist is a self-sustaining congregation. Members and friends' generosity help us do the sacred work of bringing justice, spirituality, and compassion to our community and beyond. You can give online at ccunola.org/stewardship or by text at 504-370-2659. Don't worry, I'm going to post all that in the chat box in just a minute if you didn't get that. For virtual donations, please note that there's about a 3% processing fee. So if you're able to add that into your calculations when you give, that would be much appreciated. And as always, you can mail us a check at the address I'll post into the chat box. Hey, Alicia, if you're playing audio, I don't think anybody can hear it.
Sorry. Let me try one more thing, because I did try to work this out last time. Okay. Please tell me if this works.
Honor the dark as you do the light. Receive the gifts that come to us by day and by night. I choose to honor the dark, uncertainty and change. Deliver us from fear until only love remains. Honor the dark as you do the light. Receive the gifts that come to us by day and by night. I choose to honor the dark, uncertainty and change. Deliver us from fear until only love remains. Honor the dark as you do the light. Receive the gifts that come to us by day and by night. I choose to honor the dark, uncertainty and change. Deliver us from fear until only love remains. Honor the dark as you do the light. Receive the gifts that come to us by day and by night. I choose to honor the dark, uncertainty and change. Deliver us from fear until only love remains. Honor the dark.
As people of faith, we commit to affirm, practice, and promote certain values like truth, love, and justice. And as a byproduct of that, we commit to an identity. Because the values we personally want to affirm, practice, and promote are affirmed by a given faith community, it becomes important to us to belong to that community, to be identified with it, have it be a part of our identity. That's true to a greater or lesser extent for most people of faith, not just Unitarian Universalists, but Baptists or Catholics, Buddhists or Jews, Tigers or Saints, whatever religious affiliation you're committed to. And yet most religious traditions have a teaching about spiritual growth and change. One of my favorite examples is a Presbyterian preacher my dad used to listen to. This fellow sold subscriptions to his Bible study class. And every so often as a subscriber, my dad got an audio tape cassette in the mail. He gave them to me when I went to seminary. And from time to time, this Presbyterian minister would repeat his teaching about personal spiritual growth. He would say, God loves you just as you are, and God loves you too much to leave you that way. And he talked about becoming God's people, not being, becoming. So every tradition tries to reconcile the reality of human growth and change with some recommended fixed stars, values to steer your life by. And so what I want to explore a bit this morning is that byproduct of commitment to a community of faith, the way we become a church family and adopt and grow into a shared identity around a shared set of values. Since we do that mostly the way all families do, through stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, I'm going to approach it by that analogy. I'm going to get at it by talking about my recent exploration of my family's genealogy, something I've done with my found time during this pandemic. And what it has shown me about the stories we tell and don't tell and why, and how these can impact our commitment to the values we say we want to commit to and be identified with, especially about truth and love and justice. And what I learned about my family growing up is that we were late 19th century German immigrants to the United States, and oh yes, the name Beedle is English. This story, first of all, is obviously incomplete. It reflects the fact that we spent a lot more time in contact with my mother's family than with my father's. Also, our identity as German immigrants was recent, so that our assimilation had taken place within living memory. Growing up, I learned the most about that by bringing a cassette tape recorder along on one visit to my grandmother's house when I was about 13. My grandmother told me about how we stopped speaking German. In rural Iowa, where they settled, when telephones came in, they were set up as what are called party lines. You didn't have your own private telephone line. You shared it with your neighbors, which meant if you picked up the phone to make a call, instead of a dial tone or an operator, you might hear your neighbor talking to someone. And that meant in the years around World War I and World War II, if your neighbor picked up and heard you speaking German, they might feel they had a duty to report a potential spy. So we stopped speaking German on the phone and any other non-private place and discouraged our children from it. I thought of that as a German-American experience until a light went on for me at a People's Institute training that this was my family becoming white. You're not white in America if you don't speak English, no matter what your skin color is. Sometimes you're not white even if you do speak English, as many Irish families found out. But at least you weren't black. Ethnicities get erased by white supremacy culture because they're too complicated. They muddy up white loyalty and superiority. Gotta be white and pure, you see. When I saw our experience in that light, it became more than nostalgia. It became a teaching story about how white supremacy culture affects white people. And it strengthened my commitment to undoing it. On my dad's side, our family had been in America much longer. We didn't know how much longer, except that my cousin Bob got interested in genealogy and traced the Beatles back to the American Revolution. As Bob likes to say, there was a Beedle in the boat rowing when Washington crossed the Delaware. I'll take that with a grain of salt, but he's right that some of our ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. But we had not held on to stories about the revolution and how those ancestors took part. What we were certain about was that our name was English and we were rooted in Madison County, Iowa. Do you remember the movie, The Bridges of Madison County? My cousin, Billie Jean McNabb, daughter of my dad's sister, played one of the waitresses in the diner scene in that movie. They hired some local talent, and that was Billie Jean's first break from local theater into movies. And when I started exploring our genealogy this spring, I wondered how long we'd been in Iowa and what road led us there from England. What I found was two very distinct stories, two very different roads, tracing both the Beedle family and my paternal grandmother's family, the Benges, back, as it turns out, to colonial America. The Beedles descended from Robert Beedle, who came from somewhere in England or Wales, settling first in Connecticut and then on Long Island in the village of Hempstead, New York. 3 generations lived in Hempstead from about 1645 until probably the 1720s, when Jacob Beedle moved to New Jersey. In the mid-1700s, his son and grandson were living in Western Pennsylvania, and the next 3 generations wandered the Northwest Territory, modern Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, until my great-grandfather, Abraham Beedle, led them to a place that God showed him, Madison County. I suspect that the Beedles' sense of being rooted in Madison County may have been a reaction to the family's experience meandering in the Northwest Territory. Abraham Beedle's grandfather, Abraham Covalt Beedle, was the first of us born in the Northwest Territory at Covalt Station, a site now in Cincinnati's suburbs, then a fortified settlement built by Revolutionary War veteran Captain Abraham Covalt amidst the Shawnee people who didn't want white settlers on their land. Established in 1789, Covalt Station was abandoned in 1792. Abraham Covalt Beedle was born there in 1791. His father, Joseph Beedle Jr., served in the Revolutionary War and was living in Western Pennsylvania at the same time as Captain Covalt and may have served with him in the war. Well, after Covalt Station, the family migrated to West Central Indiana, where Joseph Jr. is buried, and to East Central Illinois, where Abraham Covalt Beedle is buried, and then on to Madison County, where the next 3 generations are buried. Starting with Joseph Jr., 4 generations wandered in the Northwest Territory before crossing the Mississippi to the Promised Land. I think that was an unsettled time that the family forgot with relief, and I think probably many potential teaching stories were lost to us, lost to our new formed identity as Midwesterners and Iowans. The Benges story and their journey was quite different. And in my experience, the Benges were much more interested in their connection to each other here and now as an extended network of cousins than in their family's extended history or heritage. And I believe there were incentives down the generations not to talk about that past. Even the fact that I am speaking of the Benges as them and referring to their history and not ours is an artifact of the Benges' silence. Here's what I've learned in the last couple of months. William Benge, born in Wrotham, Kent in 1571, became a member of the Virginia Company and moved to Jamestown in 1619 to look after the family's investment in tobacco. That's the same year that the first Africans arrived in Virginia, about 40 miles from Jamestown at Point Comfort. He brought with him his wife and 4-year-old son, John, who was raised in Jamestown and raised his own family there. And John's son, Robert, was the first to venture west, settling in what would become Albemarle County, where Charlottesville is today. Indeed, Robert Benge and his son, Thomas, might have known Peter Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's father, and greeted him as a new neighbor when he acquired the land where Monticello stands today. Well, so far, so bland. But then came Thomas's son, John, who came to be known as Trader John Benge. Trader John was born in Albemarle County, and after Charlottesville was founded in 1762, he was 28 years old then and married just a few years with 4 children. He moved his family to town. Now, John Benge and his wife, Elizabeth Lewis, are the only relatives that I've found who are documented as slave owners, but I think they were hardly the first. He was known as Trader John because he established a successful trading post at the Cumberland Gap, trading with Virginia colonists and the Cherokee Nation. Probably to further his business interests, Trader John took a second wife among the Cherokee. Her name was Werthe, and she was the daughter of John Watts, an English colonist who served as an interpreter for the Cherokee. And he had married a daughter of a Cherokee chief. And I'll let you decide how artful an interpreter he must have been by letting you know that his nickname was Old Forked Tongue. Such marriages were, I believe, political. In the Cherokee clan system, alliances were formed by becoming part of the family. That could be by marriage, as with Old Forked Tongue Watts and Trader John Benge, or I gather it could be by adoption. In any case, Trader John had a total of 12 children, about half with each wife. As a descendant of Elizabeth Lewis, the Charlottesville slave owner who later dissolved her marriage to Trader John, I cannot claim any Cherokee lineage, but thanks to Trader John, there is a branch of the Benge family that can. Indeed, my 4th great-grandfather, Thomas O. Benge, was half-brother to the notorious red-haired Captain Bob Benge, a leader of the Cherokee during the Cherokee Wars fought between 1776 and 1795. Bob Benge was notorious for his cunning and ruthlessness in attacking white settlements, including his part in an event near Knoxville called the Cabot Station Massacre. Alexander Cabot had acquired land and set up his fortified shelter or station and begun to farm. His station was one of many around Knoxville. In September 1793, Bob Benge was part of a war party, 1,000 to 1,500 men strong, led by his uncle, John Littletassel Watts. That was Werte's brother, Trader John's brother-in-law. They planned to destroy Knoxville, but took too long to get there. They wanted to attack before dawn under cover of darkness, but when they were still about 8 miles from the city, dawn broke and they heard the Knoxville Reveille cannon fire. That was your daily morning wake-up call if you were a Knoxville resident. But the Cherokee thought it might mean they'd been detected. So they stopped their march on Knoxville and instead attacked Cabot Station, which was inside of where they stopped. Bob Benge's part in this was to go and persuade the Cabots to come out of their stockade, assuring them that they wouldn't be harmed. But then they were all killed. For another 7 months, Bob Benge continued to attack farms, raiding as far as Southwest Virginia. He was hunted down by a colonial militia, ambushed near Stone Mountain in Georgia, where he was the first of his men to fall. His red-haired scalp was sent to the governor of Virginia, who forwarded it to President George Washington. So that's our family connection to him. I share that story to say that Eastern Tennessee was not necessarily a comfortable place to live after that if your name was Benge. And I've learned that in 1838, a Captain John Benge conducted the 4th wagon train on the Trail of Tears. I don't know yet what his lineage was. The Cherokee Wars ended in 1795 and Tennessee became a state in the next year. Bob Benge's half-brother, my 4th great-grandfather, Thomas Benge, hung around Tennessee the rest of his life, but his son, Alfred, made his way to Iowa sometime before the Civil War. Alfred was a shoemaker, served as a saddler for Company I of the Iowa 4th Cavalry Regiment. He was injured and apparently sent his son Anderson to replace himself. They each served about a year and both survived the war. Now, I'm tempted to believe that Alfred hid his connections to the Cherokee when he arrived in his new life in Iowa. I'm tempted to believe that his service in the Union military was a strategic choice to assimilate and to forestall any of his neighbors looking into his Southern roots or Cherokee connections. In the following generations, the Benges shed all vestiges of them. My father knew nothing of any Southern or Cherokee connections in the family. But now that I've learned about this family history, I feel I've recovered another teaching story. The things we lament today as abuses and evils of capitalism were right there, full-blown in colonial Virginia and the adjacent territory that became the state of Tennessee. They were interwoven then as now with the abuses and evils of colonialism, which are the roots and foundation of white supremacy culture. This chapter of the Benge family story helps me feel more deeply the weight and see more clearly the legacy of colonialism and capitalism. I see it and feel it in William Benge's participation in establishing Jamestown and the slave-dependent tobacco culture. I see and feel it in Trader John's pushing it into the Cherokee Nation. I see and feel it in the way the Benges were split between both sides of a conflict over spreading or resisting these evils and abuses, and the broken relationships and dislocations that resulted. This struggle was not market competition. It was just meanness. And it was money taking priority over life. As people of faith, Unitarian Universalists are as susceptible as any Beedle or Benge to losing our teaching stories. Generally speaking, we mostly know just what we hear each other saying about our faith now. The UU principles, the 5 smooth stones, our social justice work, something about covenants, a handful of famous American historical figures we claim, and a vague sense of European roots that famously involve Transylvania. And some of us know some parts of that in more detail. The most detailed stories that we tell are often local stories. In New Orleans, it's a story about Theodore Clapp, preacher extraordinaire, congregational minister, come to serve the First Presbyterian congregation in the city. His theology developed into Universalism, which caused the church to split, and the faction who retained him as their minister affiliated with the Unitarians. Church members were leaders of progressive era New Orleans, and starting in the 1940s, the church called ministers who actively challenged Jim Crow. That difficult commitment, as well as sustained post-war boom, led to the founding of a second enduring UU congregation. And in time came the third, and today we are a partnership of 3 congregations. Some of us know more details about all that because we've talked about it. About 8 years ago, we talked about it in some depth around the time we field tested a UUA curriculum called Resistance and Transformation. And Reverend Melanie preached a sermon in all 3 churches called The Story of Us. We took a brave and honest look at our history of social justice ministry in New Orleans. It's rare for a family to take a brave and honest look at itself. But I find that when we do, the challenge of it strengthens our commitments, not least our commitment to truth. The way we go about it challenges, but can also strengthen our commitment to love one another. And with clarity about our commitments to love and truth, we're in a position to gain clarity about our commitment to justice and a greater capacity to work effectively for justice in our city. Each of our 3 congregations is stronger, and their combination as GNU is stronger when each congregation has a sense of identity built on a commitment to shared values, especially truth, love, and justice, and a brave and honest account of its history. So I leave you with some questions to ponder. What stories are you telling yourselves about yourselves? Who is Community Church? What is the shared story of Community Church, including your connections to First Church and to a UU congregation that was started upon a day on the West Bank, as well as to GNU? What social justice ministries have you made a long-term institutional commitment to pursue? And what is the story of how you came to and sustain that commitment? The stories we tell and don't tell, the reasons we tell and don't tell them, do shape our commitment to the values we profess and say we want to be identified with. Churches, like families, can be tempted to assimilate to the culture around them. Churches, like families, can be afraid of being judged by their neighbors. Churches, like families, can bury their past. But y'all can craft and tell and retell a true story of identity and commitment that encourages each of you to live more deeply into your shared values, especially truth, love, and justice, so that collectively you may pursue effective social ministries that create more love and justice in New Orleans and beyond. May you ponder deeply. Amen. Is there music here, or do I go on to the benediction?
Hey, you can move on to the benediction, Reverend Paul.
Okay. Then go out into the world in peace at an appropriate distance, and have courage. Hold on to what is good. Return to no one evil for evil. Find creative ways these days to strengthen the faint-hearted, support the weak, and help the suffering. Honor all people. And may the identity you claim strengthen your commitments to truth, justice, and love.
All righty, everyone. We're glad that you've joined us in this time of worship and worth giving, and hope something spoke to you, as I know it did me. Stay connected, because in 10 minutes, a virtual coffee hour will begin, led by member and past president Dion DeVille.